Marantz and Echo Zheng. Take it away. University of California, Irvine.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting us. My name is Nick Marantz. I'm an associate professor of urban planning and public policy at University of California, Irvine.
I'm Echo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Irvine.
And so our presentation today, which draws largely on an article that we published in Housing Policy Debate, I think is a nice complement to the two prior presentations. And in fact, it explicitly discusses one of the programs that Magda mentioned in her presentation. And so we're going to talk about a type of housing policy intervention that is relatively widespread in the Northeast, as we'll see. And we're going to talk about when it works, the circumstances under when it works, how well it works for providing access to what you might call high opportunity areas, or where there's frequently overlap with exclusionary areas. And sort of when doesn't it work? And why doesn't it work when it doesn't work? So just to sort of start out with some definitions and some motivations, as probably many of you know, in the United States, local governments typically exercise extensive authority over land use regulations, right? And so when we're talking about local governments, we're talking about general purpose local governments like towns, cities, and the kinds of, we can sort of as a shorthand characterize the relevant regulatory authority as zoning authority, right? Which is the power to delineate the permissible uses of land. And in the United States, in particular, detached single family housing is a very popular housing type, as you'll know if you have spent much time in most of the populated areas of the US, and is sort of the dominant residential housing type in much of the US. And so the zoning authority includes the authority to limit or prohibit apartment development, which is particularly problematic for housing affordability. And it's particularly problematic for housing affordability in places where land is very expensive because there's a lot of demand for housing. And so a state affordable housing appeals regime or system empowers developers of low market rate and mixed income housing to challenge local land use regulation. And I'll explain in a moment a bit more about how that works. But first, I just want to give you a sense of the geography of these systems. So these are the states that have adopted state affordable housing appeals systems. And how do we define a state affordable housing appeals system? We define it as providing an expedited appeals procedure for developers of qualifying projects in non-exempt municipalities. So there's a lot going on in that sentence. So let me unpack everything in that sentence. Expedited appeals procedure means that you can get your project through the review pipeline faster than you would otherwise be able to. So typically, if you want to build a housing development, you have to apply for a number of permits. You may have to apply for some kind of deviation from the existing zoning, right? And you may get challenged in court, or you may have to challenge, if you're a developer, you may have to challenge the municipality if it denies your permit application. And all of that takes a lot of time. Time is money in the world, throughout the world, but particularly in housing development, where a lot of money might be tied up in carrying costs for a property, in interest payments. And so this expedited appeals procedure can make otherwise financially infeasible projects financially feasible. In many states, in I guess 3 of the 4 states, there's a shifting of the burden of proof from the developer to the municipality. I think this is a little ambiguous about whether this is the case in Rhode Island. But so typically, if a municipality denies a project or imposes conditions on the project, it's an uphill battle to show that those conditions were unreasonable, or the term used by courts frequently is arbitrary and capricious. And so a state affordable housing appeal system can shift the burden of proof from a developer to a municipality. So now the municipality has to show that its conditions are reasonable, instead of the developer having to show that the conditions are unreasonable. The third is a builder's, which means that if the developer wins, the developer gets to build the project. So, courts or administrative agencies can impose a variety of different kinds of remedies, and frequently in cases challenging local land use regulation, the remedy is just to tell the municipality, well, you have to revise your zoning. Well, if the municipality revises its zoning, that can be a multi-year process, and there's no guarantee that the revised zoning will allow a particular project to be built, right? So a builder's remedy says it will result in the project that is the subject of the challenge, the legal challenge, being built, or at least having a very high probability of being built, and frequently through the override of local zoning requirements. This is something that I think really distinguishes these northeastern states from a state like California that has no zoning override for projects that qualify for its many regulatory programs for mixed income housing. So, and the final element is an exemption criteria for municipalities. So once a municipality reaches a certain threshold of affordable housing, it is no longer subject to this housing appeals system. Okay. So what are the potential benefits of such a system? It could increase the stock of deed restricted below market rate housing, that is housing that is restricted by deed to be affordable at no more than 80% of area median income. And of course, the potential for that is just a direct consequence of the design of the program, right? It only applies to projects that include below market rate housing. In particular, it could increase below market rate housing in high opportunity areas, which are frequently exclusionary areas because of this zoning override, right? One of the main barriers to below market rate housing in exclusionary areas is zoning. Well, if a system provides for a zoning override, then it can increase the amount of below market rate housing in these exclusionary areas. It could also increase the stock of units that are affordable to moderate income households, because a lot of these projects are mixed income projects. For example, in Massachusetts, a project can qualify if it's a rental project, if 25% of its units are affordable at 80% of area median income, right? So the remaining 75% of the units are going to be market rate units, but those market rate units are going to be much cheaper than than the detached single family market rate units in the same jurisdiction. And finally, it can increase the affordability of existing units through supply effects. Today, we're just going to focus on this second potential outcome, which is increasing below market rate housing in high opportunity or exclusionary areas. And so I want to talk a little bit about what might determine how effective one of these systems is in increasing the stock of affordable housing in high income, high opportunity, exclusionary areas. One is the extent of supply constraints and the level of demand in the housing market, right? This is the primary actors in this system are developers, and they're actually for-profit developers. So they're basically cross-subsidizing the market rate, the below market rate units with the profits they expect from market rate units. And so those profits are going to be much higher in areas where there's a lot of demand for housing and where supply is highly constrained. The second is, and this is a source of variation among the systems, the availability of a comprehensive permit for qualifying projects. So when a developer goes before a local board, does it get all of its permits in one? Or does it still have to apply for a bunch of different permits? And there's some variation among the four SAHAS state affordable housing appeals system states with respect to the availability of a comprehensive permit. Another issue is the clarity and consistency of the fair share standard for municipalities, right? Each municipality has some fair share standard, and until it meets that standard, it is subject to the affordable housing appeal system. Once it meets the standard, it is no longer subject to this appeals system. So if it's very clear where the standard is, then there's unlikely to be a lot of litigation over whether the municipality is in fact subject to the system. And so we see a very clear and consistent standard in, for example, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, a very unclear standard in New Jersey when it had an affordable housing appeals system. Finally, not finally. I'll actually, I think I'm gonna, maybe in the interest of time, sort of summarize a few of these points, and we can return to them maybe in the discussion. But there's also variation in terms of whether municipalities get exempt from this system for building housing or for planning for housing. And we would expect that if municipalities only get exempt for building housing, that might result in a more effective system than if they get exempt for planning for housing. Fourth, fifth, there's it matters how, it may matter how deep the income limits are for below market rate units, right? So if because these are cross-subsidized and rely on the incentives of private developers, if you go way below 80% for the income limits for the subsidized units, that's going to cost the developer more money and may reduce developer appetite for these programs. And second of all, and why do I keep saying that? Finally, we're talking about administrative review for qualifying projects rather than judicial review. That is to say, do the appeals go through an administrative process or do they go through the courts? And we might expect quicker resolution through an administrative process. All right, so this is the study area for our empirical analysis. We're looking at the Massachusetts component of the Boston metro area, the Rhode Island portion of the Providence metro area, the Hartford metro area, and the New Jersey portion of the New York metro area. And so, as I said at the top here, the supply constraints and the level of demand in a housing market are likely to play a role in the effectiveness of this system. And so right off the bat, we can see that there's pretty significant variation among our study areas in terms of demand. So here we're looking at the ratio of what's called the minimum profitable production cost, which is essentially the replacement cost of housing adjusted for the cost of sites in an unconstrained market and the average profit earned by home builders. And so this is the ratio of housing price in each of these metro areas to the minimal profitable production cost. That's on the y-axis here, the vertical axis. And basically a ratio below 7.5 suggests that there's very little profit to be made from building more housing. And so we see metro areas in that range include Youngstown, Detroit, Rochester. Between 0.75 and 1.25, we're looking at prices that are not materially different from minimum profitable production costs. And so here, these are not booming housing markets, but they're not housing markets where we wouldn't expect to see any new development. Above 1.25, we start to see housing markets where there's very high demand. And so there's a lot going on in this graph, but what I want to point to in particular is that the Boston metro area and the New York metro area are above that 1.25 line, and the Providence metro area is between the 0.75 and the 1.25 line, but closer to the 0.75 line. So it's a much weaker housing market than in terms of levels of demand than Boston or New York. On the x-axis here, we see a measure of permitting to a ratio permitting to housing stock. And so what you expect is that in the upper left-hand quadrant here, the metro areas there would be very expensive. They're high demand areas with very little housing allowed. And lo and behold, they are the most expensive metro areas in the US. So this fact that there's this variation in demand between the Providence metro area and the Boston and New York metro areas, I think informs a lot of what we see when we turn to our empirical results, which we'll do right now. Echo.
Wait, I thought I start with the second analysis, but okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so first we're going to compare state administrative data indicating the number of deed restricted below market rate units in the states with state affordable housing appeals systems. Second, we're going to do a regression analysis. And this will enable us to compare the 4 states with these systems to New York, which does not have a state affordable housing appeals system. And then we're going to look at the proportions and rent burdens of low-income households residing in high opportunity census tracts. All right, so just to start with a simple descriptive analysis, what we see here is if we're comparing across metro areas, we could see that we're dividing census tracts by income categories. And so what we see here are below market rate units among these different types of tracts. And so in Providence, what we see is that overall there's 4.7% of the units are below market rate units, but those are concentrated in moderate and low income census tracts, right? So that's about 5% in the lowest income category and about 4.5% in the moderate income category and only 2.5% in the highest income category. In the Hartford metro area, we see an even more pronounced skew towards the concentration of below market rate units in the lowest income census tracts. So 5.6% versus 2.6% in the highest income tracts. In the New Jersey portion of the New York metro area, we see more below market rate units in the highest income tracts, right? So although if we look at the bottom row, the overall percentage of below market rate units is lower than in either the Providence metro area or the Hartford metro area, there's not a skew towards lower income tracts. In fact, there's a skew towards higher income tracts. And finally, if we look at the Boston metro area, we have, first of all, the highest or the highest percentage of below market rate units overall. That's the 4.8 number in the bottom row. And they're almost evenly distributed among the lowest income tracts, the middle income tracts, and the highest income tracts. All right. So now, Echo, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I'm gonna try to do this a little bit quicker. So in the first analysis, these below market rate units are coming from aggregated administrative data. So short of having this comprehensive tally of below market rate units, our next analysis will look at the citing of low-income housing tax credit projects in these states with state affordable housing systems. We are interested in LIHTC projects because they are connected to the efficacy of the systems in two ways. So first of all, local restriction on multifamily housing developments could prevent LIHTC projects from being built in certain places, and an affordable housing abuse system could facilitate LIHTC development by constraining local discretion on permitting multifamily housing. And LIHTC funding can also be used to preserve the affordability restrictions on existing units. So municipalities in these states will have an incentive to preserve these affordable units because they can count towards meeting their obligations. Next slide. So this is the study area. We will be comparing the metro components in these 4 states with an abuse system with the metro area in New York State, which does not have this system. Next slide. We'll also be focusing on LIHTC projects in high opportunity census tracts, which we adopt 2 separate definitions. So the first one, the middle to upper income tracts, are those with median household income above 120% of US median in the 1990 census. And the second one are low poverty tracts with households with less than 10% of households below the poverty line. Next slide. This table just shows the number of these 2 types of high opportunity tracts in each metro area. So we're also excluding tracts in the largest city in each metro area because we are primarily interested in below market rate housing developments in suburban communities. Next slide, yes. So we're using logistic regression analysis to look at the location of LIHTC projects. I'm going to skip the technical details, but essentially we are comparing each of these states with New York State that has no state affordable housing system in place. Next slide. So we can see that in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, this number we are looking at here are called odds ratio. They are statistically significant for both definitions of high opportunity tracts. So here in Massachusetts, this odds ratio of 2.5 means that the odds that a LIHTC project occurred in high opportunity tracts in Massachusetts is roughly 2.5 times the odds in New York State tracts. And Rhode Island has odds ratios in even greater magnitude, ranging from 4.5 to 5.5 times the odds that similar New York State tract would have at least a LIHTC project. And lastly, we essentially find no difference between New Jersey and New York, and this is consistent with an earlier study that Nick and I did way back. We found that New Jersey's system primarily resulted in the production of condos rather than multifamily rental units. Next. So in this last analysis, we compares rent burdens in high opportunity tracts, and in the interest of time, we'll focus on New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Next slide. So in the case of Massachusetts, in these different types of high opportunity tracts, we can see that the share of low-income renter households in Massachusetts is consistently and significantly higher compared to New York. Also, the share of non-rent burdened low-income renter households is also higher in Massachusetts. So these non-rent burdened low-income households are those spending less than 30% of income on housing. Next slide. In the case of Rhode Island, the results are slightly less consistent. For example, we do not observe difference in upper income tracts between New York and Rhode Island. So while not shown in this table in our paper, the difference we found between New York and Connecticut, it's also not as pronounced as that in the case of Massachusetts. And we essentially found very little difference between New York and New Jersey in terms of rent burdens in renter households. Next slide. To sum up our empirical findings, when comparing these 4 states with state affordable housing systems, we find that Massachusetts appeared to have this higher proportion of below market rate housing units in higher income municipalities compared to these other states. And when comparing the states with New York that has no state affordable housing abuse system in place, we find that LIHTC projects are more likely to be located in metro areas in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island compared to New York. And again, we don't find much difference between New York and New Jersey. And last, we just show that high opportunity tracts in Massachusetts have a consistently higher share of low-income households, and also a lower share of these renter households are rent burdened compared to New York. So taking all these together, we find that Massachusetts system is particularly effective, and this is likely to be linked to its housing markets and also the design features of the system. I'm gonna end here and we can open up to questions.
All right. Thank you to our panelists for such insightful research.